Are we really facing population collapse if the best estimate of population change is that it will continue to grow for another 50 years to 10.3 billion before starting to taper off into the next century? That is still 2 billion more people on Earth than live on Earth today. A lot of people are talking about population collapse. A lot of people are worried. It's understandable. Lower birth rates and more older people are changing how our society works. Some people have made very alarming predictions. Some have even predicted civilizational collapse. For example, Elon Musk said population collapse due to low birth rates is a much bigger risk to civilization than global warming. But should we be alarmed or just alert? Or should we do something else? Adapt. I say that some of the population collapse talk is a bit of a panic. Welcome to the Burning Archive, where I, Jeff Rich, help you try to make sense of a puzzling world with some quality world history and a bit of literature thrown in as well. So what is happening to global population? Is it going to collapse? And how will changes like lower fertility and increased aging affect our lives, our culture, our politics, and our connections across borders, our geopolitics, our international relations? It is a central question of geopolitics in history, but also a central question of demography and for governments. One demographic expert has said that these future trends in fertility rates and live births will completely reconfigure the global economy and the international balance of power and will necessitate reorganizing societies. Elon Musk has referred to civilization ending in a whimper in diapers. It's a provocative line, but Musk has also thrown his weight and money behind the population collapse cause and is amplifying alarm and calling for many changes in policies and approaches across government and societies. It sounds scary, but is it right? A viewer requested a video for me on this topic because it is a confronting scenario. It is a scary scenario that populations might collapse. So a special thank you to Studio Rhino for suggesting this idea. And if there's other topics or issues or aspects of history that you'd like me to do a video on, leave me a comment below. On this channel, I like to look at how long-term trends, also known as history, have changed society and culture, and how thinking about these global issues can be informed by history. After all, Emmanuel Todd, whose book, The Defeat of the West, I've done a couple of videos on, is a demographer. That is his specialty. He looks at how population dynamics change over time. But in this particular case of the discussion of population collapse, it's not just a historical curiosity that has drawn me to this video. It also connects to my 30 years of work as a government official, in which I largely advised in social policy roles, including issues of fertility and IVF and population aging and population statistics, health statistics as well, mortality statistics and all that sort of thing. So when I watch a lot of the popular YouTube videos on this issue of population collapse or population crash or Is humanity about to experience a disaster? I'm reminded of many of the old polemics that I would encounter in people's discussions of these issues, and some of the, I guess, rookie errors that people often make, even top-level bureaucrats and politicians often make when thinking about a complex issue like population and how it changes over time in response to all sorts of things like fertility and mobility and changing health and other issues. So I thought I would have something a little bit extra maybe to add to this video, and a little bit of insight maybe to help you think independently about this issue and not get carried away with the memes. Now, one way of simplifying the discussion or the debate on this topic is to talk about three styles of thinking about population change or population collapse, about big changes in population. You can have the alarmists on one hand, and on the other hand, you have the alert people. And then finally, you have the adapters, the people who adapt to the changes. So let's look first at the alarmists. What are people arguing when they're saying that the population might collapse and that this is a major issue we all need to confront? The alarmists argue that fertility rates, the numbers of children born to families, to women, are now so low that that the population can't be replaced, that more people are dying than are being born, and hence at a certain point of time the population will collapse. No one's having children anymore. You hear these kind of statements. And they might be saying it about the world population, or they might be saying it about particular countries. There's often a focus on South Korea or Japan or Russia or China. And the argument goes that with demographic collapse will become all sorts of tensions. There will be economic collapse. The vitality of the economy will go because there are no young people anymore. They're all old people. Civilization will whimper out in its diapers, according to Elon Musk. And there will be political instability and even potentially migration wars, conflicts between countries over controls of borders and controls of population. Now, there are some facts supporting these arguments. Fertility rates are below replacement levels in many countries. Replacement levels being the number of children that need to be born to get the same level of population in later generations. Total populations have begun to fall in some countries. Even the formerly largest country in the world, China, is projected to see a significant decline in its population, although it will remain the second largest population in the world for a very, very long time. And population aging, increased life expectancy, the changed proportion of older people compared to younger people also means that the ratios of old people to children and of old people to working age adults has changed, and that has all sorts of economic and social security and family dynamic changes as well. So Elon Musk is one of the most prominent of these alarmists, and he has backed many advocates and programs and activities, especially in the United States of America. Some countries have adopted pro-natalist policies, and often there is a rhetoric arguing for the importance of having natural increase of population rather than relying on sustaining population through migration levels. It's not such a big issue in where I live in Australia, because Australia is a country that has been growing in population size largely on the back of migration since 1945, if not 1788. And in the United States especially, there are some what you might call, after Kamala Harris, weird right pro-natalist advocates of various positions. For example, Malcolm and Simone Collins have attracted lots of attention. These groups of people are often supported by effective altruism, the sort of Californian philanthropy, tech billionaire philanthropy like Elon Musk. And in the case of the Collins, they also have some pretty strange ethics about genetic testing of children and genetic selection of IVF babies. And I did spend a couple of years of my life looking in depth at the whole ethics and law and treatments and services of IVF, or assisted reproductive treatment. But it's not only people in the United States. There are demographers like, I think it's Paul Morland, and with support from the podcaster and journalist Philip Pilkington, who has produced a recent report that suggests that, Britain has to make a choice between migration, natural increase in fertility, or economic decline. There is a Club of Rome projection that the global population might fall to 6 billion by 2100, so in 75 years. So that's about a 20% reduction. And the historian Neil Ferguson, in a recent Bloomberg article, also talked about population change. He said not many people foresaw the global fertility collapse, nor did just about anyone expect it to happen everywhere. And I can't recall a single pundit predicting just how low it would go in some countries. I don't know if his assessment is terribly right, but he certainly jumped on the population collapse bandwagon. Then there are geopolitical analysts like Peter Zeihan, who likes to talk about demographic collapse, especially in China and Russia and in the rivals of the United States. There are all sorts of people who, from different angles and driven by various motivations, express this concern about population collapse. There is some substance to what they say. Lower fertility rates, older populations are real. The question is, how do they project a story out into the future of collapse from the actual known facts of the history and the current statistics today? But what really fueled the talk, I think, in the last 6 months was a study by the Institute of Health Metrics and Evaluation, published in the prestigious medical journal, British medical journal, The Lancet, and sponsored by the Gates Foundation, that produced a new, more pessimistic projection or forecast or modelling of global reductions in population as a result of lower fertility rates. That article, one of the lead authors, Stein Emil Volset, said, "We are facing staggering social change through the 21st century. The world will be simultaneously tackling a baby boom in some countries and a baby bust in others, as most of the world contends with the serious challenges to the economic growth of a shrinking workforce and how to care for and pay for aging populations. Many of the most resource-limited countries in sub-Saharan Africa will be grappling with how to support the youngest, fastest growing population on the planet in some of the most politically and economically unstable, heat stressed and health system strained places on Earth. These changes and in the Lancet article, they comment that these changes in age structure are likely to present considerable economic challenges caused by a growing dependency ratio of older to working age population and a shrinking labour force. Now, this is big talk, and the Institute of Health Metrics and Evaluation, which is based at the University of Washington in the USA, is to be commended for taking a much more global and equity-focused approach to this issue of global population change than, say, Elon Musk or some of the weird right people in the United States. But a lot of this talk of population aging and fertility change, contrary to what Neil Ferguson said, is really nothing new. Here in Australia, we've been talking about this challenge since the 1980s. Since the 1990s, there's been a thing called the Intergenerational Report that looks exactly at the considerable challenges caused by a growing dependency ratio of older to working age population and a shrinking labour force. It has been part of the absolute core business of government policy people like me for the entire 30 years of my career in government, really. So none of this sort of discussion is particularly new or alarming. I think it is rather a lot of people catching up with news, but then getting a little bit frightened by more pessimistic projections in this recent study by the Institute of Health Metrics and Evaluation. I've got a link in the video description below to the Institute of Health Metric Evaluation study in the Lancet if you want to get into the details. But you can see from some of the rhetoric there about baby bust and staggering social change that they are sexing up the data just a little bit. But generally, the alarmists do, I think, bias their assessment of their valid facts with a few sort of issues in their argument. They're really presenting a story, a collapse narrative story, and they're letting that story drive their assessment of the data more than just a little bit. They grossly exaggerate the nature of the social changes, the nature of the demographic changes, and the nature of the behavioural responses. Elon Musk says civilization will die in diapers. Really, is that what is happening all around us? Population aging has been going on for a long time. And as a result, the distorted numbers create this, collapse story. Most of all, I think they misunderstand how societies actually do adapt and have adapted frequently to changed demographic patterns over time. And the alarmists' collapse narrative feeds thinking habits, wanting to see a dramatic fall in the graph there. It feeds thinking habits that drive, I think, somewhat dodgy use of data. There are loose use of terms like exponential growth and its obverse collapse, and not really more measured assessments of what happens with growth in populations. We saw a lot of this in recent years after 2000 with the pandemic and the war and all sorts of, data experts, data scientists bringing an ability to communicate clear graphs about numbers and using that to have a lot of impact with their stories when they don't really understand the underpinning phenomenon, the underpinning health issue, the underpinning social issue of fertility, population aging, population dynamics, growth dynamics in populations. They don't really understand those issues. And as a result, a lot of their Data science is really just playing around with spreadsheets. The alarmists often show no real understanding of that fundamental social phenomenon. They tend to have a fixed model of how, the world works, what working age population is, what old people are capable of, what social roles mothers and children are expected to play. They don't really look at the actual current realities of how families, older people, births, transfers of wealth and money and, social support between generations actually works. Nor do they really look at how high migration population growth societies like Australia have actually worked and adapted over time. They tend to be very reliant on simple notions of incentives changing people's behaviour, and they simply seem to be ignorant of the basic history of population dynamics over the last 100 or 200 years. Aging began a long time ago. Fertility rates have been dropping for a very long time, contrary to Neil Ferguson's comment. There's not a lot of reference to, quality, demographically based history like Emmanuel Todd's. And finally, there's a sort of a sense in which as there always will be, I guess, with issues of fertility, aging, families, social structures, values play a big part in people's perceptions of the issue. Religiosity, gender issues, attitudes towards gender inequality, urbanisation, childless cat ladies. The alarmists also often display somewhat American, if I might say that, geopolitical or Western cultural prejudices or biases. They tend to get fixated on certain cases out of context, like our friend Peter Zeihan. They focus on Russia and never really mention the, why life expectancy fell in Russia in the 1990s, or why, 27 million people died in Russia in the 1940s. They look at China, they look at Japan, they look at South Korea, and they also tend to be very focused simply on measures of GDP rather than other issues. And we should all, especially people living outside the United States, be careful about this for a reason that is often contained in the arguments of the alarmists. They will often refer to the Ehrlich's book, Population Bomb, from the late 1960s, 1968. And this case often gives a sense of credibility to the alarmists. They say, until yesterday, everyone was worried, like the Ehrlichs in the 1960s, that, the real problem facing the world was population growth. But they've got it wrong. We've got it right. What we should really focus on is population decline. And, there is a little mini history of Ehrlich in Peter Frankopan's book. In Peter Frankopan's book, The Earth Transformed, An Untold History, in that book, he has a look at the whole concern in the 50s, 60s, 70s, that there was a huge hunger problem, that the world could not produce enough food to sustain the population that it had. And there was a lot of concern. There's a lot of concern from the CIA, the World Bank, many US government officials, and the American-based philanthropic foundations like the Rockefeller Foundation about this world population concern. It predated Ehrlich's 1968 book, The Population Bomb, and it all occurred in the context of, the populations who couldn't feed themselves were also the former colonies of the European and American empires of the world. China, India, Africa, Asia, the Philippines, all the rest of it. And this concern to some degree drove some of the technological changes of the Green Revolution. It also, and here Peter Frankopan says, such dire warnings as Ehrlich's, that population control is the only answer. Such dire warnings helped propel government interventions into reproductive health, which ranged from sex education and the promotion of family planning to programs of large-scale forced sterilisation, including, if I'm not correct, especially in Africa and in India, with very, very tragic consequences. And it also had a paradoxical effect in China. China, for a long time, wasn't so concerned about population. It also was following a different economic model for how to feed its people. But the concern led initially to relatively moderate population control policies in the 1970s, and then finally to the one-child policy, the well-known one-child policy in China in 1979, which occurred not during the Maoist era. 1979 was after Mao had died, not during the Cultural Revolution era or the Great Leap Forward. It happened in the era of the great market reformer Deng Xiaoping. And Peter Frankopan says that while usually interpreted as a sign of central coercion by a communist party determined to implement an effective modernization program, in fact, almost all the principal ideas of the one-child policy that underpin the policy were borrowed from the West and from Western science. So we should be very skeptical of modelers and Western tech billionaire philanthropists proposing policies on population. All collapse narratives ultimately collapse because they don't really fully understand the dynamics of the society that they're talking about. Okay, what about what I call the alert school of thinking about population collapse? It might seem a bit unfair to put the Institute of Health Metrics and Evaluation from the University of Washington into the alarmist camp, although I will point out to people that it is the same outfit that did a lot of the modelling of the pandemic in the early days of 2020. In July 2024, the United Nations Population Division, which is really the world's core expertise on population projections, population dynamics, that gathers together all the statistics from all around the world and makes the highest quality estimates and publishes all its methodologies. It released in July 2024 its latest population projections, and it actually directly comments on the scary scenario put forward by the Institute of Health Metrics and Evaluation. Needless to say, the alert assessment of the United Nations Population Division has received less publicity than the scary model put forward by the University of Washington. I would say, from my years working in government on social welfare, I really think one should trust the assessment and the modelling and the projections and advice from the UN Population Division much more than a philanthropically funded private initiative in the United States of America. And the Population Division actually published 10 key messages from its latest assessment of the world population and its assessment of these trends of fertility rates and aging. And I think these 10 lessons represent, I guess, the core, reliable, positive assessment of what the real situation with population collapse or population change really is. I think one should pay close attention to them. The 10 key messages from the latest United Nations assessment of population change, what are they? Okay, number one is that the world's population is likely to peak within the current century. Specifically, their estimate is there will be 10.3 billion in the mid-2080s, falling to 10.2 billion by 2100. That talk from the Club of Rome of 6 billion by 2100 is 4 billion off, according to these estimates. No small margin of error. And it's also much higher than the estimates, much later than the estimates put forward by, say, Neil Ferguson or the University of Washington that talked about population dropping, particularly from the 2060s. Are we really facing population collapse if the best estimate of population change is that it will continue to grow for another 50 years to 10.3 billion before starting to taper off into the next century? That is still 2 billion more people on Earth than live on Earth today. Secondly, 1 in 4 people globally lives in a country whose population has already peaked in size. So there's the global phenomenon and then there's the national phenomenon. And obviously there's all sorts of different dynamics and populations in each of those. So there are 63 countries that have peaked in population before 2024, but 126 countries will continue to grow until 2054 for another 30 years. So there are countries that are in a state of decline. There are more countries that are still growing. Thirdly, women today bear 1 child fewer on average than they did around 1990. That is, there are 2.3 live births per woman. Still, as you can, 2.1 is the replacement rate. Globally, it's still above the replacement rate, down from 3.3 births in 1990. Now, that is a steep decline, but live birth rates have been declining. Like, for example, in Australia, I think they were 3-something in the late 1960s, and they've really been declining ever since. More than half of all countries and areas globally have fertility below 2.1 births per woman. So that's a lot of countries that are in this situation of below replacement rate fertility. The sky is not falling down quite yet. Fourthly, early childbearing has harmful effects on young mothers and their children. Even today, after all the efforts to reduce teenage pregnancies because of those harmful effects, both physically, emotionally, and socially. Imagine having a child when you would otherwise think you're at high school. All those effects, there are still 3.5% of babies internationally born to mothers under 18. That is not ideal. And so we're raising, if you like, the social age of commencing motherhood for all sorts of good reasons, but it's not a hard limit, but the reasonably hard limit of the age of fertility for women hasn't really increased all that much. It has increased a little bit with IVF and other technologies, but with significant costs. So if you like, the window of child rearing is definitely decreasing, and that is not an easy problem to solve, but it also does actually solve some problems. Having many children, as used to happen, being born to mothers aged, 12 to 18, is not necessarily a good thing for those women, for the children, or for society. Fifthly, following the COVID-19 pandemic, global life expectancy is rising again. 73.3 years in 2024, an increase of 8.4 years since 1995. Further reductions in mortality are projected to result in an average longevity of around 77.4 years globally in 2054. That's an extra 4 years of extended life over the next 30 years. Not bad going. Of course, the United States of America is a bit of a weird case here because their life expectancy is dropping in a way that hasn't really been seen since the influenza pandemic of First World War of 1918. Sixth main lesson from the United Nations is that the main driver of global population increase through the mid-century will be the momentum created by growth in the past. If you like, this is cohort effects. One of the rookie traps with looking at population statistic is to look at like point of time comparisons, whereas populations, people go through a life cycle encapsulated in the idea of generations. One generation's experience will be different to others. And that causes different dynamics. Once you've got a bit of a growth going in the population, it's hard to wind it back. And similarly, the other way around. The number of women at ages 15 to 49 is projected to grow from nearly 2 billion in 2024 to a peak of around 2.2 billion in the late 2050s, driving continued growth in population, even if the number of births per woman falls to the replacement level. And this is a key point in thinking about some of the sloppy thinking about trends in the population collapse sort of analysis. Seventh, countries with youthful populations and declining fertility have a limited time to benefit economically from an increasing concentration of population in the working age. In the working ages, this is a well-known, developmental phenomenon. Whether it will continue to work out the way it has over the last 50 years or so is a more open question. But I think places like India, for example, the population dynamics of fewer children, longer and healthier lives means that there is more people in that ages 18 to 55 peak working age population. And because of that, it's what they call a demographic dividend. There are about 100 countries around the world experiencing this demographic dividend. It's not all doom and gloom. For many countries, the population dynamics are going to work in their favour, even if that does mean changing wealth and income and economic patterns around the world. The eighth point is, and this is a dramatic comparison, by 2080, so that's like 55 years from now, persons aged 65 or older will outnumber children under 18. By the 2030s, those aged 80 and over will outnumber infants 1 year of age or less, reaching 265 million. It is a real mental flip for how we see the social and age character of the society around us. I know when I was working on population aging, you could visualize this in the population pyramids, which have moved from like that shape to that sort of shape over time. But I always found another way of looking at it was I always remember seeing these old photographs of, the street urchins of London or New York. You'd see pictures of the street in the early 20th, late 19th century, in which there were children everywhere. And in relative terms, the ratio of children to adults and then of children to old people has changed dramatically. If we take a walk down the street today, we see many, many, many older people many, many fewer children. But is that really a catastrophe? I guess it depends what we get used to. The next point, the 9th point in this list of 10 points, is that for some populations, immigration will be the main driver of future growth. Now, this is in some quarters an extremely contentious point, but I come from Australia, and as I think I mentioned earlier in the video, Australia is a country that has grown in its population on the back of high migration really since the post-war migration program 1945, and arguably even before then. Certainly in the 19th century, there was massive migration around the world of European people into the United States of America in the 19th century, into Australia, into, there was massive migration from, European Russia to Siberia in the late 19th, early 20th century. The late 19th century was an era of enormous migration movement. So migration is not simply a very recent phenomenon. We need to think about it more holistically and think about how to manage it, I guess. But the United Nations also points out that there are 50 countries around the world where immigration will attenuate these patterns of declining population due to fertility and other trends. In fact, countries like the United States, Australia, and Saudi Arabia are actually going to see growing population, unlike others, as a result primarily of migration. But the patterns of migration into each of those countries is quite different. And there's a startling comparison of the different regions of the proportions of migrants in the workforce in Australia, United States, Europe, and various Asian regions that I think is worth many people having a look at to avoid some of the more hysterical arguments about migration that you see on the internet. 10thly, their final point is that gender equality and women's empowerment help to counter rapid population growth or decline. They comment that discrimination and legal barriers limit women and adolescents' access to sexual and reproductive health services, raising the legal marriage age and integrating family planning into primary health care can enhance women's education, economic participation, and reduce childbearing. Women's role in society is not just to keep the fertility rate up, it is actually to live a good life, and one needs to look at a rounded perspective on that. And in other words, we don't need to be alarmed. We need to adapt. Many people clutch at these fears of population collapse and argue we need to put in place incentives like tax benefits and things like that to get more women having children. But I think it's important, and what the UN is really saying, that it's not incentives or artificial objectives for population growth, but grounded social policies that look after people, that will really help that whatever the population dynamics into the future, they work well for people. They say in countries where populations have peaked already or are likely to peak in the next 3 decades, policies providing paid parental leave and flexible working arrangements, supporting affordable high-quality childcare, providing comprehensive care for an ageing population, and encouraging an equal distribution of caregiving and household responsibilities between men and women can improve women's labour participation, helping therefore with the economics of changing dependency ratios, support families, encourage childbearing, and increase economic security for men and women at older ages. None of these policies are especially radical, but I think there also needs to be a mindset shift in the way we think about things, about how populations do change over time, how the society does change over time, and we need to adapt to that rather than apply our fixed ideas from 20, 30 years ago, or textbooks or religious texts to how society should work. And I think particularly we should rethink some of the key dynamics about changing population, fertility, aging, life cycles, how relations and transfers between generations occur, migration, what national models are, and indeed what growth models are. Is it really such a disaster if our population in a particular country is static or diminishing a little bit? May not work for the property developers, but it may well work for everybody else. People need to stop thinking a zero-sum game about fertility and aging. Systems, our social systems, our ways of supporting each other, both publicly and privately, across generations, across genders, are constantly adapting. So I hope that video is giving you some peace of mind about thinking about some of the alarming commentary that has been occurring over the last year or so on population collapse. I think some of that commentary is ill-informed, ill-judged, and irresponsible. And if you'd like to check out more of my perspective on history, geopolitics, and making sense of a puzzling world with quality history and a little bit of government experience, why don't you go to my Substack at jeffrich.substack.com. There's a free weekly newsletter you can join there, and options to get a little bit of bonus material from me for a small additional contribution. Thanks so much for watching.